The last bell tolled at sunset on a Sunday in September 1987. By the time it finished echoing across the cornfields, St. Mary's Lutheran Church had held its final service after 114 years. The congregation of 12 elderly parishioners locked the doors, handed the keys to the county clerk, and drove away into the gathering dusk. Within 5 years, the building would be demolished, its century-old oak pews sold at auction for $50 each. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was the beginning of the end of an era that had defined the American Midwest for over a century. Between 1980 and 2020, more than 8,000 rural churches across Iowa, Illinois, Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the Dakotas closed their doors forever. That's roughly 5 churches every week for 4 decades. These weren't just buildings disappearing. They were the beating hearts of communities, the social glue that had held small towns together since the frontier days. What happened? How did institutions that survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and countless harsh winters finally surrender to forces they couldn't overcome? The answer is more complex and heartbreaking than you might imagine. To understand the magnitude of this loss, we need to travel back to 1885, to a muddy crossroads in central Iowa, where a group of German Lutheran farmers gathered under an oak tree. They had pooled their money, exactly $247, to build what would become Emmanuel Lutheran Church. These men had calloused hands and worn boots, but they shared a vision that would define rural America for the next century. Within 6 months, they had raised a simple white wooden structure with a bell tower that could be heard for miles. By 1900, that church served 340 families spread across 50 square miles of prairie. It wasn't just a place of worship. It was the town's meeting hall, school auditorium, community center, and emergency shelter. When the Great Blizzard of 1912 struck, the church basement housed 17 families for 3 weeks. This pattern repeated itself thousands of times across the Midwest. Churches became the foundation upon which entire communities were built. In Harmony Township, Minnesota, population 450, there were 4 churches within a 2-mile radius: Methodist, Lutheran, Catholic, and Presbyterian. Each served not just as a religious institution, but as the anchor for networks of mutual aid that kept farmers alive during lean years. The churches were repositories of local knowledge. Pastor Heinrich Müller at Emmanuel Lutheran kept meticulous records not just of baptisms and burials, but of weather patterns, crop yields, and community events. His journals, discovered in 2019 during the church's demolition, revealed a sophisticated network of information sharing that helped farmers adapt to changing conditions. When the railroad finally reached their county in 1897, it was Pastor Müller who negotiated with the company to ensure fair shipping rates for local grain. But perhaps most importantly, these churches were the training grounds for civic leadership. The man who organized the church building fund often became the town's first mayor. The woman who managed the church ladies' auxiliary typically ended up running the school board. Democracy in small-town America was quite literally practiced in pews and parish halls every week. Hello there, curious minds. You've stumbled upon Professor Archive, where history's most fascinating stories come to life. Before we continue unraveling this remarkable tale of vanishing churches, I'm curious. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Are you a teacher, farmer, student, or perhaps someone else entirely? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into American history, consider leaving a super thanks. It helps us keep bringing you these carefully researched stories. The first cracks in this seemingly solid foundation appeared in the 1950s, but they were so subtle that most people didn't notice them. It started with something as innocuous as better roads. When Highway 20 was paved through central Iowa in 1954, it cut the driving time to the county seat from 90 minutes to 35 minutes. Suddenly, the county seat's larger Methodist church, with its professional choir and full-time pastor, seemed more appealing than the struggling rural churches that could only afford a part-time minister shared with 3 other congregations. But the real catalyst was economic. Between 1950 and 1970, the number of farms in Iowa alone dropped from 203,000 to 140,000. The surviving farms grew larger, but they required fewer people. The children of farmers began leaving for jobs in cities, and they rarely returned. Consider the story of the Hendricks family, members of Emmanuel Lutheran since its founding. In 1955, 5 Hendricks brothers farmed adjoining sections of land, each with his own family, each attending church every Sunday. By 1975, only one brother remained, farming all 5 sections with modern machinery. His children lived in Des Moines and Chicago. The church that once counted on 5 families now had one elderly couple who drove 20 miles each way to attend services. This pattern accelerated through the 1970s and 1980s. Agricultural consolidation meant that small towns lost not just population, but entire social networks. When the local bank closed, when the grain elevator was sold to a distant corporation, when the last family-owned store shut down, the church lost both its financial base and its social relevance. Then came what historians now call the rural crisis of the 1980s. Farm foreclosures reached levels not seen since the Great Depression. In Iowa alone, 15,000 farms were lost between 1981 and 1986. These weren't just statistics. Each foreclosure meant a family leaving, taking with them decades of church membership and community involvement. Grace Methodist Church in Millerton, Kansas, kept detailed records of this period. In 1980, they had 89 active members and an annual budget of $31,000. By 1987, membership had dropped to 34, mostly elderly members living on fixed incomes. The annual budget had shrunk to $8,400, barely enough to keep the lights on and the roof repaired. The final entry in the church secretary's logbook, dated March 15, 1988, simply reads, "Motion to close carried, 8-1. May God forgive us." But closing a rural church wasn't just an administrative decision, it was a community trauma. These buildings held 4 or 5 generations of family history. Wedding photos were taken on these steps. Christmas pageants were performed in these sanctuaries. Community members were buried in these cemeteries, their graves tended by church volunteers for decades. The psychological impact was profound. Dr. Sarah Martinez, who studied rural church closures for the University of Nebraska, found that the loss of the local church often triggered what she termed community grief disorder, a collective sense of loss and disorientation that could last for years. When the church closed, one former parishioner told her, it felt like the town had lost its soul. Some churches fought desperately to survive. They tried merging with neighboring congregations, sharing pastors across multiple counties, converting to part-time lay leadership. First Presbyterian in Oakdale, Minnesota, sold their historic building and moved services to the community center. St. Paul Lutheran in rural Missouri began meeting in members' homes, rotating from farm to farm each Sunday. These efforts occasionally succeeded for a few years, but they often just delayed the inevitable. Rural churches faced a perfect storm of challenges: declining membership, aging congregations, rising maintenance costs for deteriorating buildings, and the difficulty of attracting clergy to remote, poorly paid positions. The irony was devastating. These churches had survived the frontier era, the Spanish flu pandemic, the Dust Bowl, and 2 world wars. They had weathered theological controversies and denomination splits. They had adapted to social changes and technological advances, but they couldn't survive the fundamental economic restructuring of rural America. Consider the fate of St. Catherine's Catholic Church in Winnebago County, Iowa. Built in 1889 by Irish immigrant farmers, it served a thriving rural community for nearly a century. The church kept meticulous records, and they reveal a fascinating pattern. From 1889 to 1960, membership grew steadily, reaching a peak of 187 families. But then came the decline. 156 families in 1970 89 in 1980, 34 in 1990, and just 12 in 2000. The final blow came in 2003 when the Catholic diocese announced it was closing 47 rural parishes across the state as part of a pastoral reorganization. St. Catherine's made the list. The last Mass was celebrated on All Saints' Day, November 1, 2003. The altar was removed and relocated to a church in Waterloo. The stained glass windows were donated to a seminary in Dubuque. The building was sold to a farmer for $15,000 and demolished the following spring. Where St. Catherine's once stood, corn now grows. The human stories behind these closures are often heartbreaking. Margaret O'Brien had been the organist at St. Catherine's for 43 years. She played for hundreds of weddings, funerals, and Sunday services. When the church closed, she was 78 years old and had nowhere to use the musical skills that had defined her adult life. "I still wake up some Sunday mornings and think I need to get ready for church," she told a local newspaper reporter in 2005. "Then I remember there is no church." But the impact extended far beyond the congregations themselves. Rural churches had served as informal social service agencies, providing food pantries, emergency assistance, and counseling services. They organized community events, maintained local cemeteries, and preserved local history. When they disappeared, these functions often disappeared with them. The economic impact was also significant. A 2018 study by the Rural Sociological Society found that the loss of a rural church reduced local property values by an average of 3.7% and decreased local business revenue by approximately 8%. Churches had been economic anchors, attracting visitors for weddings and funerals, supporting local florists and caterers, and maintaining historic buildings that drew tourists. Some towns tried to preserve the buildings even after the congregations disbanded. The community of Ashton, Nebraska, population 187, raised $75,000 to purchase their historic Lutheran church when it closed in 2009. They converted it into a community center and museum. But maintaining a century-old building without the volunteer labor and community investment of an active congregation proved overwhelming. By 2015, the roof was leaking, the foundation was cracking, and the heating system had failed. The building was demolished in 2017. The demographic reality was stark and unforgiving. Rural America was aging rapidly. In many Midwest counties, the median age rose above 50 by 2010. Young people continued leaving for educational and economic opportunities that simply didn't exist in small towns. The few who remained often lacked the deep community ties and religious commitment of their grandparents' generation. Technology also played an unexpected role in the church's decline. As rural internet access improved in the 2000s, some isolated families began attending services online rather than driving long distances to struggling local churches. Televangelism and online worship services provided professional programming and dynamic preaching that overwhelmed rural congregations couldn't match. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated trends that had been building for decades. Many elderly congregation members, the core of rural church membership, were afraid to attend in-person services. Churches that had been barely hanging on found themselves with no attendance at all. The financial impact was catastrophic for institutions that depended on weekly offerings to pay utility bills and minimal pastoral salaries. First Baptist Church in Elm Creek, Kansas, had weathered 127 years of challenges. They survived the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 by holding services outdoors. They endured the Dust Bowl by opening their doors to refugees from harder-hit areas. They persevered through World War II despite losing half their young men to military service. But COVID-19 proved to be the final blow. When they were forced to suspend services in March 2020, average attendance was just 7 people, all over age 70. When restrictions lifted in late 2020, only 3 members felt safe returning. The church held its final service on December 20, 2020, and sold the building to a farmer the following month. Yet amidst this story of decline and loss, there are also tales of adaptation and resilience. Some rural churches have found innovative ways to serve their changing communities. Prairie Chapel in rural Iowa began offering drive-in services in their parking lot, allowing farm families to attend worship without leaving their vehicles. The format proved so popular that they continued it even after COVID restrictions ended. Other churches have embraced technology in creative ways. Trinity Lutheran in Nebraska live streams their services to former members who moved to cities but still want to maintain connections to their home community. They've created what they call a digital diaspora of supporters who contribute financially and participate in online Bible studies and prayer groups. Some rural churches have broadened their mission beyond traditional worship services. Crossroads Community Church in Missouri operates the only food pantry in their county, serves as an internet hotspot for students during the school year, and hosts community meetings in their fellowship hall. They've positioned themselves as a community resource center rather than just a worship venue. The story of rural church decline also reveals broader truths about American society. These institutions flourished during an era when communities were geographically bound and socially integrated. People lived, worked, worshipped, and died in the same small radius. Social media and modern transportation have created new forms of community that transcend geographic boundaries, but they lack the deep, multi-generational bonds that sustained rural churches for over a century. There's also a theological dimension to this story. Rural churches were often theologically conservative and resistant to social changes that urban churches embraced more readily. As American society became more secular and diverse, rural churches sometimes found themselves defending positions that seemed increasingly out of step with mainstream culture. This theological isolation made it even harder to attract new members or retain young people. The architecture tells its own story. These rural churches were built to last centuries, not decades. Their solid stone foundations, handcrafted wooden pews, and stained glass windows were investments in permanence. Many were constructed with volunteer labor and local materials: limestone quarried from nearby fields, oak milled from local forests, brass fixtures fabricated by the town blacksmith. Walking through an abandoned rural church is like entering a time capsule. Hymnals still sit in pew racks, open to songs that were sung for the last time years or decades ago. Church bulletins from final services lie scattered on floors. Wedding photos and confirmation class pictures hang askew on walls that no one tends anymore. The cemeteries often outlast the churches themselves. Rural church graveyards are maintained by county governments or cemetery associations long after the congregations have disbanded. They become repositories of local history. German surnames carved in limestone, infant mortality rates revealed by tiny headstones, military service records preserved in bronze markers. These silent acres tell the story of communities that once thrived but exist now only in memory. Some denominations have tried to address the crisis systematically. The United Methodist Church launched a rural ministry initiative in 2015, providing grants and training to help struggling rural congregations develop new models of ministry. The Lutheran Church has experimented with circuit rider pastors who serve multiple small churches, reviving a frontier-era practice. But these efforts face enormous challenges. Young seminary graduates are often burdened with student loan debt that makes low-paying rural positions financially impossible. Urban and suburban churches offer better salaries, professional development opportunities, and social amenities that rural communities can't match. The pool of qualified clergy willing to serve isolated rural churches continues to shrink. The Catholic Church has been particularly hard hit by the rural crisis. Catholic parishes require resident priests, but the number of priests has declined dramatically, while the average age has risen above 60. The Church has responded by consolidating rural parishes into larger units served by a single priest. But this often means the end of weekly Mass in small communities that had celebrated it for generations. In some cases, the buildings themselves have found new purposes. Former churches have been converted into wedding venues, antique shops, art galleries, and even private homes. The Gothic Revival architecture and soaring ceilings make for dramatic renovations, but these conversions represent a complete break with the building's original purpose and community function. The preservation movement has had mixed success in rural areas. Unlike urban churches, which often benefit from historic district protections and tourism revenue, rural churches lack the visitor traffic and economic base needed for sustainable preservation. The National Trust for Historic Preservation estimates that rural churches are demolished at 3 times the rate of urban historic churches. Climate change has added a new challenge. Extreme weather events have become more frequent and severe, and rural churches often lack the resources to repair storm damage. Hurricane-force winds, flooding, and ice storms have claimed dozens of historic rural churches in recent years. Many congregations, already struggling financially, simply can't afford to rebuild. The social consequences of rural church decline extend into politics and community cohesion. Churches had served as training grounds for civic leadership and community organizing. They provided neutral spaces where neighbors could come together despite political or economic differences. Without these unifying institutions, rural communities often become more socially fragmented and politically polarized. Education has also been affected. Many rural churches operated Sunday schools that provided religious education, but also general literacy training and community socialization for children. Youth programs connected teenagers across multiple small towns and provided leadership development opportunities. The loss of these programs has left gaps in rural communities' social infrastructure that are difficult to fill. The environmental impact is often overlooked. Rural churches typically occupied prime locations in town centers or on prominent hills. When they're demolished, these sites often remain vacant or are converted to commercial use that changes the character of the community. The loss of church bells, which had marked time and announced community events for generations, creates an acoustic silence that many residents find unsettling. Economic development experts have begun studying the correlation between rural church decline and broader community decline. Towns that lose their churches often struggle to attract new businesses or residents. The psychological message is clear. If a community can't sustain its most fundamental institution, potential investors and newcomers may question its long-term viability. But there are signs of hope and innovation scattered throughout the Midwest. Some communities have developed creative partnerships to keep their churches alive. In Minnesota, the towns of Sacred Heart and Renville, 8 miles apart, merged their Lutheran congregations but maintained both buildings. They alternate services between locations and share pastoral leadership and expenses. Other churches have embraced seasonal schedules that reflect the rhythms of agricultural life. Prairie Faith Community Church in rural Iowa holds services only during the growing season, from April through October, when farm families are present in the community. During winter months, they hold online services and small group meetings in homes. Technology has created unexpected opportunities. Rural churches with strong Wi-Fi signals have become community gathering places for remote workers and online students. Some have added business centers and coffee shops to generate revenue while serving their communities in new ways. The pandemic taught even traditional rural churches to embrace streaming technology, expanding their reach beyond their immediate geographic area. The story of rural church decline is ultimately a story about the transformation of American life itself. For over a century, these institutions provided stability, community identity, and social cohesion in agricultural regions that formed the backbone of American food production and cultural values. Their disappearance marks the end of a distinctive way of life that shaped the character of the American Midwest. Yet this isn't simply a story of loss and decline. It's also about adaptation, resilience, and the search for new forms of community in a changing world. The families who built these churches were themselves immigrants and pioneers who left behind familiar institutions to create something new on the frontier. Perhaps their descendants will find ways to create new institutions suited to the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century. The empty spaces where churches once stood remind us that communities are not permanent fixtures, but living organisms that must continually adapt or face extinction. The rural Midwest is still searching for its new identity, and the outcome of that search will shape the region's future for generations to come. As we witness this massive transformation, we're not just observing the end of an era, we're seeing the birth pangs of whatever comes next. The question isn't whether change will continue, but whether rural communities can shape that change in ways that preserve what was valuable about the past while embracing the possibilities of the future. The last bell may have tolled at thousands of rural churches across the Midwest, but the stories they contain of faith, community, perseverance, and adaptation continue to resonate. They remind us that institutions are ultimately human creations, sustained by human commitment and vulnerable to human choices. In their rise and fall, we see reflected our own struggles to build communities that can endure across generations while adapting to forces beyond our control. Thanks for joining us on this journey through America's vanishing rural churches. If this deep dive into history has sparked your curiosity, Professor Archive has dozens more stories waiting for you. Just hit that subscribe button to explore more hidden chapters of American history. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep the stories of our past alive.